Hello and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to whoever's participating from different time zones. My name is Kristen DeProspero with Solutions. We're very grateful that you're taking this little bit of time out of your schedule today to join us. Very grateful. We know time is precious. We are here to talk about, this is our second day of a 2-day workshop about the USDA RUS Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant and how it scored. And we have a guest with us today, Mr. Brad Romano from New London Schools. Before I pass it to you, Brad, I just want to remind everyone on the call, number one, we're recording it. Number two, if you would like to ask questions, please put that in the chat and we would be happy to answer your questions there. Again, it is going to be recorded and sent out to you after today's session. And Solutions, just a brief overview, we're the 5th largest audio video integrator in the country with a specialty in distance learning and telemedicine projects. We have a grant advocacy team, which I run to help our customers and prospects navigate funding. And our biggest goal above all else is just awareness to make sure that all eligible candidates for certain types of grants know about those grants. You know, there's thousands of them. And that's actually how we met Brad. So we reached out to New London Schools. We spoke with Brad about this funding source couple years ago. And long story short, we are now several months, maybe even longer, or up to a year in to a successful project at their school district after they were awarded this grant. And so what we're going to do is ask Brad to share with us a little bit about what they experienced, both in the sort of application process, how they partnered with us and Poly. This is co-hosted with Poly and Solutions, and give it from a real life perspective from an applicant who won the grant and hear how you used it to your benefit at your school district. So Brad, thank you so much for joining us. If you would tell us, what was it like to go after this and how does it feel now?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to share the story of New London Local Schools, which is kind of an exciting story of a small, rural, high poverty district that kind of reached for the stars with a grant opportunity like this, finding some really strong partners along the way. And while our story is not being done written, it's moving towards a fantastic conclusion of student achievement and strong student outcomes, which is, in the end, why we do what we do. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with all of you. And the nice thing about our story is that it's not unique. It's definitely something that anybody can go after and achieve, especially with the strong partnerships with Solutions and Poly and the others that we've worked with in this process. So it started back in 2019, pre-COVID, when we were involved in another initiative through Harvard University with a rural collaborative of school districts in Ohio and New York State, actually, in determining best practices for instructing, high poverty rural students and dealing with truancy and things like that. That we were talking with about technology, and this topic of this USDA grant was brought to our table, and through that conversation we were connected with Solutions. So we sat down and started diving into the grant, and first of all, the funding for the grant. You look at $1 million for a district that has an operating costs. Our operation budget is about $13.5 million. To infuse $1 million into that budget with direct impact on kids, it was an opportunity that was too difficult or too good for us to pass up. And so then you start the planning phase of where are we at as a school district? Where do we want to be in the next 3 to 5 years? And how can the grant get us there? So we already had a technology initiative of gravitating towards a one-to-one environment for student devices and usage But we knew that having students with devices wasn't the end of the story if teachers were still using some outdated technology in their classrooms to direct, instruct, and facilitate instruction with their students. So one of the big pieces of the grant was to develop more interactive technology with the students. And that's where the ViewSonic boards kind of come into play. But as we also said, is that we are a small rural district in northwestern Ohio with high rates of poverty. Based on our community wealth indicators, we knew that there was a lot of the world outside of New London that, based on our location and our poverty levels and our reality scores, that we just couldn't get our kids out to. But with the use of the poly technology, we knew that through virtual field trips, partnerships with other rural districts outside of our region that had a lot of similarities of demographics and goals and for their students, that we could partner with those school districts through distance technology, as well as through other organizations throughout the country, and really bring the world to New London, where we couldn't take our students out to see that world. So, and that was really part of a plan that was well established within the district, but the grant and the ideas that Solutions and Poly brought to the table really kind of hit the fast forward button for us. So what we developed to be a 5-year plan, we then scaled back to a 3-year plan, with year 1 being equipment acquisition if we were successful in the grant. Year 2 is embedded professional development for our staff that Solutions provides for us. And that really kind of carries into year 3 as well for the ongoing professional development, where you want to start with the basic use of the devices that enhance your instruction at your base level, and then gravitate up to the distance learning component of it. But again, we're a small rural district. I can't emphasize that point enough. And so lack of educational opportunities in small rurals isn't the only thing that we wanted to address in this grant. We also know that it's a telehealth and telemedicine grant. And again, we wrote this grant pre-COVID. So we have to kind of keep that in mind, that a lot of the telemedicine and telehealth and distance learning and virtual learning and remote learning, those terms weren't really part of our lexicon 2 years ago, and now it's just everyday language that we use on a consistent basis. So when the grant was written, we had an urgent care in our village that was really just a year old, but we don't have a real true hospital, so to speak. And so we reached out to one of the regional medical centers and talked about how telemedicine, could develop and the gains and the impact it could have on our student population and really our community population. So when we talk about a 3-year phase, that's also kind of the latter phases of our grant proposal, is to continue to have those conversations with the regional medical center and using telemedicine to be able to utilize our school nurse, who we also receive from that same regional medical center, to help facilitate some basic diagnostic and well visits and things like that. So, we know that transportation is a barrier for proper medical care for a lot of our students and our families. And so by the use of telemedicine, our goal is that we can remove that barrier. And when students are healthier, they miss less school, which again has an impact on academic outcomes. So we wrote that first grant, like I said, in the spring of 2019. Then we were kind of shut down in COVID. So our experience of actually writing the grant was one done very remotely while we were also juggling the impacts of the pandemic during that initial school shutdown in Ohio in March. And as Kristen pointed out, we were successful in that grant. Last school year, we saw the implementation of much of the technology of what was available, because if you remember, there's a big rush on a lot of tech and kind of put things on back order for us. And so it was last spring that we were able to have the installation of much of that technology. This school year being the first full school year of having the technology in place in all of our pre-K through 6th grade classrooms. And really, it has helped us tremendously with the staff issues associated with COVID, especially the shortage of substitute teachers, where if a staff member is in quarantine, they're able to use the interactive technology, the Polycom systems, to kind of teach remotely in their home while our students are in our classroom through the use of subs or adults employed by the district that aren't necessarily teaching staff to kind of monitor those classrooms. Even more impressively is that we've been able to have students who are at home quarantining because of an exposure being able to use that same technology to interact with their peers during their academic day. As young as, you know, 4th grade, 5th grade, this is going on. And so the students aren't really missing a day of school or 10 days of school due to a quarantine exposure because of the technology. So those were things that we didn't plan when we wrote the grant, but there were definitely added benefits to the technology and the equipment and the training for our staff that we have. We were so impressed with the first round of the grant. Like I said, we did our pre-K through 6th grade classrooms, that we wrote the grant again. We were glutton for another round of punishment. And so we went through the process again, and we were successful in winning the grant the second year, which would have been last spring that we wrote it. And so we were notified this fall of the grant. And so we're in the process of putting the same type of technology in all of our 7 through 12 classrooms. And so our goal by the start of next school year is to have every classroom in our district have the ViewSonic and the Polycom technology, both to facilitate remote learning, but really more importantly, we want to get back to our initial goals of bringing the world into New London for the benefit of our students.
That's fantastic. That was a lot of information, but really, really on point. So thank you for sharing that. You know, it gets my mind spinning about you've accomplished so much, and yet there's still so much to do. But you had no idea COVID was coming, but you implemented something. I love how you said it took what would have been a 5-year plan down to a 3-year plan. There was a lot in that, but it's, I think what you're, to summarize everything that you talked about is this partnership and your pursuit of this grant has really worked in your favor. And I think those schools, especially the rural schools that are trying to adopt and adapt to this new environment where you really need to bring in other resources and be able to break down the barriers of the walls and get access to other healthcare and education resources. It's here. It's no longer the wave of the future. It is here. And so I'm really glad that you were able to get that grant and be awarded a second time. Congratulations. And that's a good point too for those of the folks, the attendees that are listening. You can apply for this if you have a need to expand. You can apply for this repeatedly. It's not a one-time, one and done. So thank you very much for sharing your perspective with us. We appreciate you taking the time to join this group today. And this is our second day. And yesterday, like I said, we went through the objective scoring. Today, we're going to focus on subjective scoring. And as you can see on the screen, we have Shannon Schaefer and Victoria with us, Victoria Fine from Poly, and actually from LDA, Learn, Design, Apply, and which is an independent contractor to Poly to help provide grant advocacy, grant support services. So we have that capability inside Solutions, and we also partner with Poly and their team at LDA. So thanks, Brad. I know we have more to do and more to accomplish, and we're going to keep doing that to support you. And now I'm going to actually pass it over to Victoria. Thank you so much for joining us. And why don't you help us get into the nuts and bolts of objective scoring?
For sure. Thank you so much, Brad, and thank you, Kristen, for the intro. Can everybody now see my screen? I guess holler if you can't. As Kristen was saying, yesterday in day one, we really discussed the objective scoring for this grant and what makes a project competitive from the point of view of the sites that are involved in the project. If you have any questions about that, definitely feel free to chat them in today. We'll see if we can cover some today, or you can reach out to the team outside of this session. We're going to spend most of the time today discussing subjective scoring, which is basically the narrative that you put forth in your grant. It's, discussing the needs of your community and how the project is going to address those needs. And Shannon's going to be leading us through that discussion. And then we're also going to spend a little bit of time about talking about the other application elements. There's a lot of other elements you have to include that are not scored but required. So just a high-level overview of some of those elements. But we do want to start off today with just a quick review of this grant, just some basics that we discussed yesterday for anyone who's maybe new today, maybe didn't join yesterday's session, or if you just would like a recap because it is a lot of information. So the grant that we're talking about, again, it's the USDA's Rural Utility Service Distance Learning and Telemedicine Grant. RUS DLT is the acronym we use. And this is an annual technology-focused program, competitive grant program that typically comes out every year. It's a very consistent and reliable source of funding. So this program has been around for a very long time, since the 90s. And as Kristen was saying, it's one that you can typically apply for repeatedly as you're expanding a project, maybe adding additional services to your project. So this is really a program you can rely on long term. And our organization and solutions, we help dozens of organizations apply for this funding every single year. So we know this program inside and out. And really what the program's all about, it's about providing funding for interactive and real-time distance learning and or telemedicine projects that are going to bring services to rural areas, give rural residents access to content and resources that they might not have, might be really hard to get in these rural communities. And it's helping bridge the digital divide by doing this. Almost any type of organization can apply for this funding. So that's something that's unique as well. We don't often see that with federal grants, but with this program, even businesses can apply. It just depends on what it is that you're trying to do. There's just a few exceptions that are listed here. And also both formal and informal consortiums can apply. So that's another thing we see with grant programs a lot is sometimes the partnership requirements can be very strict, but with this program, you can really have an informal partnership. All that's needed is a letter of support to include in your application, but you don't have to have any kind of, formal legal partnership in order to have a project partner involved with you in this. Now, some details we just want to recap. So as far as the project design and scoring, this grant is really all about getting services, again, to those rural communities. And there's a couple ways you can do that. One way is you can connect rural entities together in order to share resources. So for instance, just to give you an example, you might have a project where there's multiple rural clinics. Maybe each clinic might not have a ton of resources on its own, but if you're able to connect them through interactive distance learning and telemedicine, they can now share, any specialists, any primary care physicians that they have with one another. So they now have increased access to all these resources. That's just one example. So that's connecting multiple rural entities to one another. Another way that you can set up a project is by connecting those rural entities to an urban hub. So we see one area where we see that kind of project a lot is with higher education projects. So a lot of colleges are typically going to be set up in slightly larger towns or cities. So they might not be rural themselves, but maybe a higher ed institution wants to set up a program where they provide dual enrollment services, for instance, to rural high schools in the surrounding counties. So you might have a project like that where there's an urban hub that has all these, educational resources, and through distance learning technology, they set up a dual enrollment program. And basically all the scoring is based on the objective scoring that we discussed yesterday. It's based on the sites that are receiving services. So it's based on these rural sites. So for instance, in that higher education example, the university's, rurality, that doesn't factor into the scoring because they're sending out the services. So again, it's based on these the locations that are receiving services, and we call them end user sites in this grant. As far as budget and expenditure, so this is a 3-year grant program. As we were saying, you really have a lot of freedom for how you implement this grant. You can do a lot in year 1 and have it be kind of a lighter implementation in year 2 and 3, or you can spread it out a little bit more evenly. Award sizes historically with this grant range from $50,000 all the way up to $1 million, but there is a match requirement. You're required to match. It's 15% of the federal request, so basically 15% of the grant, which is about 13% of the total project costs. So just to give an example, let's say you're requesting the full $1 million. That would mean your match is 15% of that, so $150,000, and your overall project budget is $1 million and $150,000, if that makes sense, just to give a quick round example. Not a bad match, and the only real requirement with the match is that it doesn't come from federal funding, but you can look at state funding, foundation funding, other types of funding to supply that match for you. And then keep in mind, so this program is really specific. It's all about technology. So the funding really needs to go towards technology and associated services that are going to be used for this interactive distance learning and telemedicine. Now, as far as the timing, this program, again, typically comes out every year or, every year and a half or so, and it's usually announced around this time, kind of late winter, early spring. But it does vary from year to year. But our big lesson with this program is it doesn't change very much from year to year. So you can really start planning a project anytime throughout the year. And because it's, a really effective project might have multiple partners, maybe you have many locations that you're trying to serve, it can take time to, find the right partners and kind of develop your project. So we really encourage you to start, as soon as possible. If you're interested in this, just let us know. And then really quick, I've been talking about this as a technology-focused grant, but what does that really mean in terms of eligible and ineligible expenses? So for eligible expenses, it's really about technology that you can purchase as a capital expenditure. So this could mean, video conferencing systems for distance learning or telemedicine. It could mean telemedicine carts, for instance, video infrastructure. You can get certain types of internal wiring and networking as long as it is necessary for this distance learning or telemedicine project. About up to 20% of the budget can be spent on broadband related expenses. But keep in mind, this isn't necessarily a broadband focused grant. It's more about kind of the endpoints that facilitate this type of communication, not necessarily the broadband. You can get some broadband expenditures covered, but there's other grants, even ones that are put out by the USDA, that focus more on that broadband component. Other eligible expenditures, cloud services are allowed. So if you want a video conferencing license, that can be covered here. You just want to get it prepaid for the full 3 years of the grant. And then also remote instruction if it's set up as a capital expenditure, and then technical assistance. So this is, training on how to use the equipment, for instance. You can have that included in the budget. It just can't be more than 10% of your total budget. And then ineligible expenditures, a lot of things that are allowed with other grants are not allowed here. So salaries, for instance, that's not something that you can get covered by this grant. There's no indirect costs. No evaluation costs. There's actually no required evaluation with this grant. You don't have to hire an evaluator. The implementation of this grant is rather light. They really just want an annual report where you say, this is how much we've spent, this is how much we have left. So very light on that front. If you've gone after other federal grants, this might be a surprise to you, but again, something that makes this one unique. And then they also don't want to see unrelated technology purchases. So for instance, things like computers and tablets, you really want to be careful and maybe not request too many of those. You can usually get some, but you really want to argue that they're necessary for this, interactive distance learning and telemedicine. Computers and tablets can be used for other purposes as well. So you want to make sure that, this is going to be used specifically for this purpose. And again, that's true for any other technology you get. You really want to tie it specifically to distance learning and telemedicine. Okay, so that's our quick recap. Let us know if you have questions. We'll be monitoring the chat, but I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to now talk about the subjective scoring.
Thank you, Victoria. So, and again, I know Victoria just said this, but please do just chime in with questions in the chat as they come to you. And as we're talking about this, definitely want this to be interactive again, and for you to get the most out of the offering that we have today. So I know you learned a lot yesterday, obviously, about the objective side, which is really the bulk of the scoring. But the second piece of that, of course, is the narrative piece, which is subjective. And every point counts. So this is one that you really can have fun with, and tell your story. Share that with the reviewers. Have someone working on this that's really vested in your project and the community. And we'll get more into that, but this really is my favorite part of this entire application. So as far as we're going to start broad and then kind of bring it into the specific project idea. And, as far as the grant application goes itself, you'll see that there are, various sections. It's outlined very neatly. And so all of this is kind of going to speak to those sections. In totality, this is worth 30 points. So basically, the bulk of what we'll talk about is the piece that's scored, which is 30 points. There are accompanying pieces, and those are pretty straightforward. So Tori, go ahead and we'll dive in. Thank you. So I'm not going to read all these to you, but this is kind of the outline of when you do download that grant application. These are all the pieces or the components of that needs and benefits section, and those narrative pieces. And again, not everything is scored, but everything is required. So if you don't dot all your I's and cross all your T's, these are all reasons that you would be deemed ineligible. So you do want to make sure that you pay attention to all of these. So again, let's kind of think, we're going to start kind of broad and then keep narrowing into the specific project as we go through the slide deck. So a lot of people really struggle with, what's the first step for this section? And so the best place to start is just with this overview when you start thinking about, again, who you are as an organization, as a community, who are your constituents, what do the demographics look like, etc. And while this is a narrative section, it's really good to have visual aids throughout this section for the reviewer. So tables, I love the use of tables to kind of highlight the paragraphs that you have in there. And there are reviewers who really enjoy, reading through those details, and that's what will set you apart. But it is also helpful, again, just from the ease of reading through it, and then also visually, it helps break up the page. And I think all of these are important when you have a narrative piece that's being scored. So basically, kind of you want to start with, the who, what, when, where. So this is a nice example of, just basically every site that's in the project. You can just go ahead and list that. You let the individuals know, is this a hub, end user, et cetera? Where are they located and what's the population? So again, nice overview of what the project entails is in terms of the population served. Excuse me. And this is something that you will see in other sections of the narrative. And I always like to tell people to also, it's okay if this is duplicated in other areas, because sometimes they may review just one section at a time when you have multiple reviewers. So don't be afraid to repeat the information in other pieces, in other portions. Okay, next slide, please. So again, you want to keep in mind, everybody that's applying is rural, and everybody that's applying has some type of economic need. And so when you're adding your geographic profile, again, now we're starting to kind of drill down. This is a really good opportunity to paint that unique picture about your community. In this particular example, in the Northeast, there are certainly different factors for rurality than in other parts of the country. And the same would apply to anyone who's on the call today. You know best what that looks like for your community. So if you can provide those specific examples about, maybe how far is it to the nearest physician's office or the pharmacy, or, the schools as far as connectivity or being able to commute between sites, go ahead and outline all of that information and really make it kind of that emotional storytelling, reasons why obviously you need this type of equipment for your community.
Hey, Shannon.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to add that we had someone ask if they were going to receive the presentation. I wanted to let everyone know that you will be receiving the presentation and the recording. So if you weren't able to see that in the chat, just FYI, you will be receiving a copy of all of this shortly after we end the session this week.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yes. Glad someone asked. Yeah, okay, so, and then as far as demographic profile, again, you want to really paint that picture and be the storyteller for your community. So what's different about your community in terms of need that might separate you from some of the other organizations applying? And so examples of this could be, poverty levels, education, unemployment, health outcomes, etc. And again, you can kind of outline that in the narrative, but a nice visual aid, again, is a table, such as the one included. And these are examples, but these are all great data points to include. And again, show that representation of where you're located against how that compares maybe at the state level and the national level. This is an example that organizations don't always think about, but outward migration. So we see this a lot in rural locations throughout the country where the population, actually is, again, it's an outward migration. So people aren't coming into the community new looking for employment, but they oftentimes leave the community. And, what is that attributed to? So this is where, again, you can outline some of those factors in your community that perhaps are impacting the population lack of growth. And again, here's a nice table that kind of shows the example in Mississippi of where the census population has actually decreased over time. So a community involvement and needs assessment, this is one that it doesn't have to be, I don't want individuals to feel kind of overwhelmed at the thought of doing something like this, but oftentimes communities will have, whether it's a healthcare system or a chamber of commerce, that type of thing, may have already done something like this in terms of a community needs assessment. And that's something you could piggyback on or pull information from. But there also are opportunities kind of as you think about if this is something you want to take on, to just make sure you're involving other people in the thought process and the decision making, so that RUS really wants to know that this wasn't necessarily just developed in a silo with one person at the table deciding, oh, this would be great. So any way that you kind of demonstrate that other people have contributed to the conversation and some of the decision making, I think the better in terms of that evaluative piece when RUS is reviewing this. So some examples are just a planning meeting with your community, and that could be live in person, it could be virtual, but maybe again ways that you can have it could be a smaller planning committee where you have some community partners involved, surveys. Again, it doesn't have to be necessarily incredibly sophisticated, but it does need to kind of show that you have at some point involved community members. And again, if there are community needs assessments that are already established, you can pull a lot of the language from that and kind of build onto why this project, again, speaks to those needs. Excuse me. Okay, so this is the fun part. And again, when you're a lot of, I don't know, I do really enjoy these sections because as you get to know the individuals and the organizations who really, again, are passionate about those communities or your community, it's really an opportunity to storytell. So if you want to include pictures of your community, of the sites, anything along those lines, this is the place to do it. So again, you can kind of have fun with the sections that we just talked about. And then kind of again, we started out here and we're continuing to kind of hone in on the specific project. So the needs identification and project design, this is really where you're going to kind of pinpoint, this is what we want to accomplish with the equipment. So you're going to kind of start with that primary need. And I know we've had a lot of examples, and Brad came on and kind of talked about his project and some of the needs that they initially had. So you can see where you have that primary need. That's kind of the initial step, and then we can build from there. So, in the example that we have for the presentation, to provide primary care in a school-based health setting. So that would be an example of the primary need. And then we have examples of some other options there, if you want to read through that. excuse me. Okay, Victoria, I can take the next slide, please. Thank you. Sorry, I have allergies today, so I'm a little tickle in my throat. So align needs with benefits and outcomes. And again, this is just an example for this section of how to kind of organize the information. So if you have a table format, and again, you'll want to support this with some narrative, but you can think of, okay, so we know that there's a lack of primary care. So that's a need that's pretty broad. Well, here are some of the benefits of this proposed project. So you'll have healthier students, the prevention of pandemic outbreaks. And I think that this probably was written pre-pandemic, pre-COVID pandemic. But again, you know, these are large scale ideas, but again, you're continuing to drill this down. So some proposed outcomes that you would see as a result of implementing this project would be increased attendance, greater academic achievement, you know, and a decline in the outbreaks. I will say this about, this is a federal opportunity, but it's very user friendly in the sense that you can propose as many outcomes and benefits as you would like in this section, and you're not held to this from an evaluation standpoint. So you would, you know, report back to RUS as far as the impact that you're seeing, but no one's going to come back and say, okay, you know, need number 2, outcome 2.1.2, where are you on that? So this is really your chance to kind of think outside the box, dream big, and really think about how this could impact your community.
Shannon, I love that you mentioned that, because a lot of people think that reporting and documentation that's going to be required after this grant is onerous, and it's just not. It's like one of those programs that is unbelievably mild. The heavy lifting's on the front end, the back end is super easy. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, it is. And I know anybody that has worked in federal grants before, you know, sometimes that really limits you as far as what you want to mention in your grant application. And this is really the opposite. I think they like to see that you're putting kind of that long-term thought into it. And remembering it's a 3-year project period. So again, you know, feel free to think outside the box and really kind of build on those initial ideas and where you think that you could be as a district or an organization 3 years from now. Okay, so again, we're just kind of taking you through this narrative piece to give you kind of an outline of how you would tackle this and bite it off, so to speak. So once you have your outline of what you're going to accomplish, you want to basically in the narrative, we have the tables, but also in narrative format, make sure you're citing your sources. So again, that kind of obviously lends credibility to the data that you're showcasing. And anytime you can compare your particular town or county to the state and national level, again, that just lends strength and credibility to some of the numbers that you're citing. And then the benefits, again, you can talk about in the narrative, speak to, you know, how the project is going to help accomplish or lead to those benefits. And anytime you can, again, speak to specific outcomes, the better. But again, you can start broad and then kind of hone, or I like to say hone that in, but kind of reel it in and make it more specific. That's an important point at the bottom. So never assume that the reviewer is an expert on your topic. You can keep it simple and to the point, but I think you also, you know, feel free to, again, elaborate with specific examples, or if you have specific kind of student stories you want to tell, feel free to share that as well. And then other elements to this section, you just want to make sure that you have project support. So you want to include letters of support. You don't have to have any formal MOUs in place, but again, if you have any partners, you want to include letters of support from them, or again, any letters that would be applicable to the project. We always like to say quality over quantity here. So you don't necessarily need 10 letters of support. But if you have enough that really are high quality, you know, you don't want any copy and pasting here, but ones that speak specifically to the project, that's always a good idea. If there are any, you know, organizations that are donating their staff, human resources, overhead, et cetera, you can go ahead and include those letters as well. And then alignment with the state plan. So every state kind of has their own plan that you can find online, and there's also a state director. And so you want to, again, discuss how this project lines up with that. And then non-duplication. So you have to make sure that if you have any partners, you're not, that they're not included in another application. If you've been awarded in the past, you would have to state that information. It's usually within the past 3 years. And then again, you just want to make sure the big concern with RUS is that there's duplication for any of the equipment. So you just have a statement in there of non-duplication. And some frequently asked questions. So how long does your needs section have to be? And there's not a page limitation for this one. So again, if you've worked on other federal grants, oftentimes it's kind of a scramble to make everything fit. This one's the opposite problem. But if you really, again, have someone who has that commitment to the community, I think that this is probably not a problem to have at least 10 pages, but that usually is a good kind of just starting point, I think, if you really are struggling with this. So have, I would say, at least 10 pages. If you have more, that's great. I mean, obviously you don't want to write a novel because you want the reviewer to follow along, but that's just kind of a good rule of thumb. As far as the data points, so the leader of our organization always likes to say that bad equals good, which makes me laugh every time, but it is true. So, while you want to obviously brag about your community, you also want to highlight all the things that are maybe not so great about your community, because again, you're up against all of these other regions of the country that also are struggling with poverty and with rurality. And then support letters, again, you want really quality over quantity. So don't use templates and have a nice sampling across the board. And then Victoria, you're jumping in.
Yeah, I was gonna say,
Okay.
I'll go through now. Thank you so much, Shannon. Shannon is just such an expert on the narrative portion, and it's always wonderful and exciting to hear how she explains it. I want to go through now those other application sections. Again, we're going to spend a little bit less time on this, but just want to give you a sense of what else is involved. These are things that you want to have them in there. You want to have them done right and completed, because you can potentially get, kicked out. Your application can be deemed ineligible if you don't have these components. But, definitely the scored narrative that Shannon just walked you through is one of the most important elements. That's where you really want to spend a lot of your time, but don't forget about these other ones. So oh, did I skip anything? Oh no, okay. First, so for creating a budget, because this is a technology focused grant, you do want to spend some time going through all those specific budget items, making sure that they work together. And then also you need to have a rough budget in place when you reach out to the USDA state director. So one of the things you have to have in your application is basically a letter from the state director in your state, just saying that the project kind of falls in line with the state plan, that the state director is aware of that project. And when you reach out to the state director, you don't have to have a firm budget in place, but you should just have a rough sense of how big your project is. And you also want to have a sense of your sites. So creating a budget is something that we definitely advise starting to get going on this early in the process. And then also, finding the ideal technology for your spaces and for your need can take a little bit of time. You really want to optimize that technology for what it is specifically that you're trying to do. So just a few quick things that we want to go through here. As far as knowing what technology you need, you don't have to be an IT expert in order to get one of these budgets together. We really encourage you to reach out to manufacturers, reach out to vendors, have them provide you with information and demonstrations. You can also ask your peers for reference. So maybe other school districts, other healthcare providers that you often work with. You can actually even look at previously awarded RUS awardees, like Brad, for instance, and reach out to those peers and just ask what worked for you, what didn't you like? How did you go about picking your technology? I'm sure, a lot of them would be happy to share that information. As far as getting pricing, so you can request one or more vendor price quotes. Make sure, if possible, that the vendors break out the items per project site. So one key thing with this grant is they really care about the technology going to the specific places that it's supposed to be going to, because again, it's all about getting this technology and services into these rural communities. So you'll want in your budget worksheet to break down everything by project site. So, hopefully just make it easier on yourself and ask the vendors to break that out for you that way. And then a question that we get a lot. So what if the needs change? So what if you have to potentially purchase different things than what was originally listed in your budget? So this is a unique grant where they want you, to be specific in your budget, but you're probably not going to be implementing the project for, close to even a year after you submit the application, because it takes time for the projects to get reviewed, paperwork to be put together, maybe for you to then gather internal resources after you hear that you're awarded. So if needs change, keep in mind they do have a process for making changes. It's called a change request, budget modification, and you basically submit an altered budget and then you explain why these items are changing. You want to go through, line by line and explain the changes. But we do want to say it is best to keep these changes very minimal. Things that are like for like, so if there's a computer that you had included or a video conferencing system and the model has slightly changed, maybe the manufacturer doesn't make that exact one, but they make an updated one, that is typically fine. You typically do not need a formal budget modification in order to get that change approved. But any bigger changes, kind of a bigger configuration change, is something that you would want to run by the USDA and get that approved. But they don't love huge changes. So, really try, we would say, at the front end to think about the configuration and, take the time to make this, again, optimized for your space. Don't necessarily rely on the change process, kind of use that more as a last resort if you really need to make a change. And then when can I start making purchases? So actually you can start making purchases the day after the grant is due. Obviously you're not going to know for a few months on whether you are going to be awarded the funding. So the idea is, you can start purchasing and just hope that you get awarded, and then you can ask for reimbursement after you get awarded and do all the proper paperwork. But if you really need to implement, if you're going to get going on this project no matter what, just know that you can start making those purchases as soon as the grant is due. Now, moving on from that, I just want to show you a sample budget. So some of the key things I talked about, you want to break down, again, the budget items by site. So I have an example here of, the different project sites and then all the different equipment that they're getting. I think in this example, they're all getting the same equipment, but you still want to break it out and, do it by site. You really want to separate hardware from any associated services. So if there is an installation cost, or if there is a maintenance cost, you want to make sure that is listed as a separate line item. Typically, you don't have to list every tiny thing as a separate line item. So if there's like 20 different types of cables that you have to get for this setup, you don't necessarily have to list all of those out. But in general, it's a good idea to separate hardware from certain types of services. Because keep in mind, for instance, for the training component, there's that limit where only 10% of your budget can go towards training costs. So you don't want to bundle that in with the other hardware costs, because that can cause, confusion for the reviewer, and they might potentially, kick out that line item. And then also, you just want to document your match in your actual budget. Again, this is getting a little into the weeds, but you'll see there's a section for the match on your budget worksheet. And there's also a matching worksheet that you have to turn in. They're separate Excel tabs, basically, but you just want to make sure those match to the T. Those are some of, the small little things you have to do in here, but, make sure that's consistent. And again, the match is at least 15% of your total grant request. And you really want to be, specific with the percentages. I believe they always say in the guidelines, you want the match to be to 2 decimal points in the percentage. Now, all the official application components. Now, we're not going to go through every single one of these. And again, we've spent a little bit of time on the budget, but this is just for you to get a sense of what's going to be included in the application. I think, let me just see here. We're going to go through some of the narrative bits here, but as far as things we've already talked about. So yesterday we spent a lot of time on that objective scoring. There's going to be some worksheets that document your objective scoring. And then Shannon just discussed the needs and benefits section, which is again, that big scored narrative that's really key to your project. You have to have an executive summary, something that lists all of your different sites. There's a few different narrative sections that we're going to go through, and then some, essential paperwork that again just needs to be there, or else your project might potentially get kicked out if some of these, compliance and other kinds of legal paperwork is not in there. Now, as far as additional narrative sections, so again, these are all ones that are required but not scored. So spend your time here, hit all the requirements, but this is not, the big one that you really want to spend all of your time in. You just want to make sure that these are done and done correctly. So executive summary, we always recommend doing this last because typically you can just copy and paste from other parts of your application. So I know it's the first thing in there and people oftentimes want to start with that, but do that last. I think it will save you a lot of trouble. And in the guidelines, they always have a list of, I believe like 10 to 12 different points that you have to hit in the executive summary. We recommend just numbering those out and then listing those exactly as they want them in the, exact order. Give them the executive summary in the format that they want and just make it simple on the reviewer. Scope of work, this is how where you're going to discuss how you're implementing the project. It does not have to be a super long section. We recommend just a bit of an overview of the project, how you're going to be implementing it. A table is really great to include here, so you can list out, all the various project activities, who's going to be responsible for them, and then the approximate timeline for those. And keep in mind, you're actually, you're not tied to that timeline. You want to do your best and just give the reviewer a sense of, how you're going to implement. But this is one of those other things that, you can change this. After you submit your application, you're not going to be tied to every specific date that you list on there. Also, you want to include your budget worksheet here, and you want to calculate the 10% rule. So that's what we call basically, again, no more than 10% of your budget can go towards costs like training, certain types of engineering services, network assessments. They all fall under this 10% rule. So you just want to show a clear calculation of that. Next section, financial information and sustainability. You just really want to speak to the feasibility and sustainability of your project. And typically, you want to maybe include another table here. If you have any anticipated project revenues, cost savings, or expenses that you want to highlight. A lot of times you're not going to have that much revenue. Revenue is not necessarily expected with these projects, but cost savings are going to be a lot more common. So for instance, maybe there's cost savings with limiting travel for your staff. If you're doing, professional development for staff and you don't have to have them travel from, one site and travel 2 hours to another site to receive professional development services, that's just something that you want to highlight here. And then statement of experience. So you really want to speak to the experience of your specific team that's going to be implementing this project. If they have experience with distance learning and telemedicine projects, you want to highlight that. If they have experience implementing other types of grants, you really want to highlight that. And typically you just want to include a quick little bio of each person. A paragraph is plenty. If you have their, resumes or CVs, you can include those too, just whatever is, their standard one that they have. They don't have to make anything special for this one. And then lastly, the telecommunications system plan. Now this one I will say can get a little lengthy sometimes. So the main task of this section is it's basically a budget justification. So you want to go through all of the items listed in your budget, typically line by line, and explain those items. So explain how they're going to be used in this project. Explain if they're going to, how they tie to distance learning and or telemedicine. that's going to be the bulk of this section. And again, something that's usually great to do in a table, if like the example we had, all of these sites were receiving the same technology. So if that's the case, you know, you only need to explain all those line items once and say this configuration will be repeated at all of our project sites. So again, that's going to be the bulk of this section, but there's a few other things you want to touch on. You want to provide sort of an overview of the equipment and services. So how do they all fit together? How are they maybe, you know, compatible with other systems that you currently have in place? You want to talk about how you pick the equipment and the services. So if you consulted with vendors, manufacturers, technology providers, just talk about all of that. You know, you can say like, we requested, you know, quotes from these organizations. We thought their technology would be the best for our uses. And, you know, maybe then we also looked at price and we looked at ease of implementation, all the factors that went into your decision making. You just want to go ahead and highlight those, but you don't have to go on for, you know, pages and pages on that. You just want to have a nice solid section on how you pick this. And then they're very picky about this. They also want here, even though you would have included this elsewhere, they want a list of all of your project sites again. They also want a map of this telecommunication system. So typically just a map of your project sites is going to suffice. You want, you know, use Google Maps or whatever kind of map software you like and just list out all the project sites. They want to see how far away they are from one another. And then here's another section you also want to address the non-duplication. Typically, you just copy and paste that from your narrative section. Side note, executive summary is also another section where you want to address non-duplication. So I hope you're seeing there's a lot of times where you're kind of going to be repeating the same little bit, and don't feel like you have to always rephrase it and make it new again. A copy and paste will really suffice, because as Shannon said, they sometimes just look at these sections independently, and you want to make sure you're hitting on all of those components. Don't worry about repeating yourself. And then you also do want to include a vendor quote in your actual application. So just make sure that you have that available as well. You know, it's interesting. You put your budget worksheet in the scope of work, but then you're going to put your quote here in the telecommunications system plan. It's just a interesting way that they want you to organize it. So anyway, those are these other sections, other narrative sections that again are required but not scored. And then real quick, I know we're running short on time here, but just as far as next steps, this is what we recommend. We recommend starting to develop your partnerships and determining project sites early. And, you know, that is subject to change as you're planning your project. As we discussed in the objective scoring section yesterday, this is really key to making a, you know, competitive and successful project. And sometimes you have to think through, well, you know, if I'm including these sites that maybe don't score as well on rurality, do they maybe score better on economic need? Can I include other sites that score better on both components to kind of bring up my overall score? Would a certain site that's maybe a little bit in a larger town or city maybe serve as a better hub site than an end user site? But all these things you want to start, you know, kind of going on them early and start that planning process. Another big thing, you really want to make sure that your SAM registration and your grants.gov access are up to date and that you have all that information available. So SAM is the System for Award Management. If you have received other federal grants, you probably already have a SAM registration for your organization. But again, just want to make sure it's up to date, has the right sort of certifications and representations in place. If you have questions on that, please reach out. Grants.gov, this is where you will be turning in your application. We've seen all kinds of horror stories where the person that's supposed to submit the application does not have the right type of access in grants.gov. So please don't let that be you. Get this figured out early. Make sure the person who's submitting this has the right type of access. And then schedule a free consultation. So reach out to the solutions team if you want to learn more about this program. If you're interested in applying, we're happy to provide additional information. So I think that is, last thing, determine who's writing your grant. So, there's going to have to be someone, or maybe multiple someones, who's going to be writing this grant. So it could be someone on your team. So even if it's someone on your team, you want to get that alignment early. You want to know who's doing what, who's doing needs and benefits, who's maybe doing the telecommunication system plan if they're a little bit more of a technical person. And if you want to hire a grant writer, that's also something you want to try to do that a little bit early, because sometimes grant writers just get booked up. So that's another thing. Best to address that earlier rather than later. And that's everything. And I know that brings us right to time. I mean, if you have questions,
That's
I think
okay.
we can stick around a little bit, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Shannon. I love that we're ending on the conversation of grant writers. We know of so many that have written this over decades. LDA is a fantastic team. We have a lot of other partners that we can refer you to. So thank you for taking this time. We're going to end it on the hour here. Appreciate everyone, including Brad Romano from New London Schools. Thank you. Thank you. We hope to talk with each of you independently and help you with any questions you have about this or any other grant that you might want to pursue for technology. Thanks again, Polly, for helping us host this and deliver this content. Everybody have a good week. Okay, take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye,
Sure.
everyone.
Bye-bye.